Montana Territory, spring of 1877. The wind carried the sharp scent of pine and old snow, and Odessa Avery had just buried the last man who ever called her beautiful. She stood alone behind the half-rotted church, holding her 8-year-old son's hand. His name was Billy, and he did not cry. Her younger child, her daughter Becca, only 5, sat cross-legged in the dirt, tugging weeds with quiet concentration. Odessa did not wear black. She wore the same faded dress she always wore, the one with the mended hem and threadbare sleeves. She was not pretty. She never had been. But her eyes were steady, the kind that told the truth before her mouth ever opened. The preacher had said a few words, nothing about love because there had not been much, nothing about a kind man because he had not been. But he had been their father, and he was the last thing standing between them and nothing. Now there was nothing. "Come on," Odessa said. Her voice was low, but it carried. "We cannot stay." They walked. For 2 days, they followed the creek south, her boots soaked through from snowmelt, Billy watching the trees like he expected a bear behind every pine. Odessa had heard of a place down near the edge of the Judith Basin where a widow could trade labor for a roof. She did not know if it was true, but she knew she could not stay where she was. On the 3rd day, Billy ran ahead and spotted the rider. "Ma," he shouted, pointing. "Someone's coming." The man rode a wide-chested sorrel gelding, his hat pulled low, his coat dusted in trail. He slowed as he approached, boots sliding from the stirrups before his horse had stopped moving. He was tall, sun-browned, maybe 30. His face was rough-hewn, the kind that had been carved by wind and time more than any mirror. He had a scar along his jaw and eyes the color of creek rock gray with hints of storm. "You lost?" he asked, voice low and even. Odessa stepped in front of her children. "No, just walking through Montana with 2 kids and nothing else. Our wagon broke. Husband died. We're going south." The man nodded slowly. "Name's Dawson Briggs. Got a small spread not far from here. You need food or water, I can share." Odessa hesitated. She did not trust men, not anymore, but her children were tired and they had not eaten since the day before. "All right," she said. But only for a bit. Dawson led them through a narrow path until the trees opened to a valley. A single cabin sat near the river, smoke curling steady from the chimney. A line of fence posts reached out across the grassland, some crooked, some new. It was not much, but it was something. Inside, Dawson moved slow, careful not to speak too loud or reach too fast. He poured coffee, sliced bread, and handed Billy a piece of jerky. When Odessa reached to take her share, their fingers brushed and she pulled back like it burned. "You can stay a night," he said. "Safe here." Odessa looked at her children, curled beneath a blanket on the floor. She nodded once. That night, Dawson sat by the fire and watched the flames, his hat in his lap. Odessa sat across from him, arms folded tight. "You knew he was no good, your husband," he said. She stiffened. "I did, but he still gave me them." She glanced at her children. "So I stayed." Dawson said nothing for a while, then he said, "You do not lie easy." "I never saw the point." He looked up at her. "That is the kind of woman I always figured I would marry, not pretty. Just honest." Odessa blinked, startled. "You do not even know me." "Not yet," he said. "But I want to." She did not answer, but she did not get up and leave either. By morning, Dawson had already saddled his gelding and was chopping wood near the shed. Odessa found a bucket and went to draw water, her hands steady but her mind restless. He had not tried to touch her, had not asked for anything. He had just offered help. "Where will you go?" Dawson asked that afternoon as they sat on the porch. "Where there is work. I could use help on the ranch, not much pay, but food and a roof." She looked at him. "You offering charity?" "No, I am offering work and company." She studied his face. He looked back, unflinching. "All right," she said, "but I do not owe you anything." He nodded. "I would not want you if you did." Weeks passed. Odessa worked the garden. She mended fence. She cooked when she had the strength and taught Billy how to read by candlelight. Dawson worked from dawn until stars, fixing the barn, tending cattle, clearing brush. He never touched her. He never asked. But every day he looked at her like she was the only thing that made sense in the world. One evening, after supper, she stood by the window watching the sky turn gold. "You keep looking at me like you expect me to break," she said. Dawson stepped beside her. "No. Just watching you hold everything together." "I am not pretty, Dawson." "I know." She turned her head, eyes hard. "Then why?" He reached up, slow and careful, brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. "Because you are honest. You say what you mean. You love those kids like it is breath. You take care of what is yours. That is all I ever wanted in a wife." Her eyes filled, then cleared. "I do not know how to be anything else." "Good," he said. "Do not change." That night she did not sleep on the floor. She sat beside him by the fire, close enough that her shoulder touched his. He did not move, but his hand found hers and he held it like it was the most natural thing in the world, and she let him. The spring deepened slowly, like a hand warming from cold. Snow still clung to the north slopes, but the valley's floor had softened, and green shoots pressed through the thawed soil behind the cabin. Odessa woke early each day, often before the sun. She didn't move quickly, but she moved with purpose, bucket in hand, checking the coop or walking the line of fence Dawson hadn't yet mended. She didn't ask for help. She gave it. That morning, Dawson found her in the lean-to behind the barn, sleeves rolled high, elbow deep in a barrel of soaked beans. A kettle clattered on a hook above the fire ring, and Becca sat nearby, humming to herself while she braided a strip of muslin. "You always work like there's someone chasing you," Dawson said, setting down a coil of rope. Odessa kept her hands in the water. "If I stop, I start thinking." "About what?" She didn't answer right away. The wind shifted, bringing the scent of damp earth and ash. She looked up at him then, not guarded, just tired in a way that didn't show in her shoulders but lived behind her eyes. "About how quick things fall apart when you don't pay attention." Dawson crouched near the fire ring, poking at the embers with a stick. "You don't have to outrun the past, Odessa. Just don't let it tell you who you are." "I don't need telling. I already know." He glanced at her, then at Becca, who had begun curling the muslin into tiny flowers. "You think about teaching them to read and write proper." She wiped her hands on her apron. "Billy knows his letters, but I never got far myself. I got a reader inside. Used to belong to my sister. She passed before the war. I could help." Becca stood and tugged at Odessa's skirt. "Mama, can I give these to Mr. Dawson?" Odessa looked down at the little cloth flowers, stitched and twisted with uneven fingers. "Go on, then." Becca padded over and held them out. Dawson took them without hesitation, crouching to her level. "These are finer than anything I ever bought in town. May I keep them?" The girl nodded and stepped back behind her mother. Later that day, Dawson saddled the mare and asked Billy to ride fence with him. Odessa watched as her son climbed up, feet barely reaching the stirrups, but his spine straight with pride. She didn't fuss. She only pressed her lips together, then turned back to the root cellar to check the last of the potatoes. By dusk, the boy returned grinning, face speckled with trail dust. "We saw a mule deer, Ma. Big one, antlers like tree limbs." Odessa looked to Dawson. "You take him far." "Only as far as he could handle. Boy's got a good eye." "Not afraid to ask what he don't know." Billy nodded, adding, "He showed me how to check for wire sag and look for scat." Odessa raised an eyebrow. "Scat?" Billy nodded seriously. "It means droppings." She gave Dawson a look that hovered between amusement and disbelief. "That what you're filling his head with?" just the useful parts. That night, Odessa lingered on the porch after the children had gone to sleep. The stars were fierce above the valley, the air still holding the day's warmth. Dawson joined her with 2 tin cups of coffee, one offered without a word. She took it, fingers brushing his. He didn't pull away. "You ever think about finishing that second room?" she asked, staring at the corner of the cabin where the roofline sloped low. "I have. Well, I was waiting to know who'd be in it." She didn't laugh, didn't smile, but her voice softened. "Takes more than a few weeks to decide that," he nodded. "Then I'll wait a little longer." They sat in quiet for a while, moths flickering against the lantern glass. "My mother died young," she said. "I don't remember her voice, just the way she folded linens like it mattered." Dawson didn't speak, he only listened. "My father remarried a woman who slapped when she was tired. I left before I was 16. Thought I was being brave." "You were." Odessa shook her head. "I was just done being scared." Dawson leaned forward, setting his cup down on the step. His voice was low. "That's what brave is." She looked at him then, long and steady, like she was seeing something not just in front of her but inside herself. "You ever been married?" she asked. "No." "Why not? Never met a woman who didn't need saving." "You don't." That made her go still. "I don't want someone to carry," he said. "I want someone to walk beside me. You do that. And if I stumble, then I'll wait till you stand again." Something in her closed, then opened. It wasn't quick. She didn't lean into him or speak his name. But she stayed beside him until the stars had shifted, and when he finally stood to go inside, she followed. The first thunder came low, distant, like a door creaking open somewhere far off. Odessa stood at the edge of the pasture with her hands resting on the top rail, watching the sky bruise along the western rim. The cattle had gone still, heads lifted, their ears pricked toward the wind. Dawson walked the line with a coil of fresh wire over one shoulder, but when the second rumble came closer, sharper, they both turned the same direction without speaking. He reached the fence and set the coil down. "That's coming fast." Odessa nodded. "We'll need to lash the shutters. The back one likes to swing in a hard wind." "I'll see to the barn. You get the door wedge from under the stairs." By the time they reached the cabin, the wind had begun to rise, pulling grit off the path and tossing it across the porch. Billy was already hauling wood inside, his arms wrapped tight around the last load. Becca crouched in the corner with a rag doll pressed close, her eyes wide but dry. Dawson shut the door behind them with a heavy thud and dropped the bar into place. The storm came in hard and sudden, like they often did across the flats. Rain beat the roof like fists, and the wind howled down the chimney, drawing smoke sideways until the fire guttered low. Odessa checked the latches, then wrapped a shawl around Becca and pulled her into her lap. Dawson crouched near the hearth, feeding the fire back to life with dry kindling from under the cot. Billy stood by the window, peering through the narrow seam between shutter and sill. "You can't see anything now," Odessa said gently. "Come sit." He hesitated, then crossed the room and sat beside her, pressing his shoulder to hers. The storm rattled on, loud enough to swallow conversation. So they sat in silence, the kind that wasn't empty but full of held breath and shared waiting. When the wind finally eased and the rain softened to a steady patter, Dawson rose and moved to the table. He poured water from the crock and set 4 cups out. Odessa took hers, then glanced at the window. "We'll need to check the stock first light." "If that back gate gave way, I'll check it before breakfast," Dawson said. "You stay with the kids. No need to drag them through mud." They didn't speak again until the children were asleep, curled beneath the quilt, their breathing even. Dawson sat with his boots off, one hand resting on his knee, the other holding a tin cup gone cold. Odessa leaned against the hearth, arms crossed. "You ever think about leaving this place?" she asked. "Used to. Thought maybe I'd head south and start fresh in the hill country or west to Idaho. But every place looked the same once I got there." She watched the firelight flicker against the floorboards. "What stopped you? Didn't have anyone to take with me, and I got tired of starting over." Odessa didn't look up. "I don't know how to rest. Even when things are quiet, I'm waiting for the next crack in the wall. That's not a flaw. It's not peace either." He stood slow and crossed to her. He didn't reach for her, just stood close enough that she could feel the heat of him. "You ever had a season that didn't hurt?" he asked. She shook her head. "You deserve one." She leaned back against the stone ledge. "I wouldn't know what to do with it. You'd learn." The fire popped and she flinched before she could stop herself. He noticed but didn't comment. "When I said I wanted a wife who was honest, I didn't mean just with me. I meant with herself." She looked up, eyes sharp. "You think I lie to myself. I think you carry things you won't name, and I think you deserve to put them down." She didn't answer right away. "Then, if I told you I didn't believe in love, would that change anything?" "No," he said, "because I do, and I believe in you." Something in her broke open and didn't spill. It just shifted. She stepped forward, slow, and reached for his hand. He met hers gently, fingers warm, steady. "I don't want saving," she said. "You're not getting saved. You're getting chosen." She let his hand stay in hers, and for the first time in years, she didn't brace for it to be taken away. They stood like that until the fire burned low and the world outside the windows was still. By early June, the ground near the stream had dried enough to plant. Odessa stood ankle-deep in warm soil, sleeves rolled past her elbows, her hands moving in steady rhythm as she pressed seeds into furrows. Becca sat nearby under a cottonwood, threading pine cones onto twine, while Billy helped Dawson on the west side, hauling rocks from the pasture edge where a new line of fence would go up. When Dawson came back toward the cabin that evening, his shirt was stuck to his back and his hands were scraped raw. He crouched by the pump to wash, and Odessa brought him a clean rag without a word. He didn't thank her, but when his eyes met hers, something passed between them: tiredness, trust, belonging. That night after supper, Odessa lingered near the fire while Dawson whittled a handle for the spade. The children had gone quiet in their bedrolls, curled like kittens on the braided rug. Odessa watched the blade of the knife catch firelight as it shaped the wood. "You do that like you've done it 100 times, she said. "I have. My father believed if you couldn't fix it, you didn't deserve to own it." "Was he hard?" "No, just firm. He didn't raise his voice, but you knew when he was done listening." She leaned back slightly. "Mine didn't listen at all, not once." Dawson set the wood down carefully. "You never talk about what you wanted before you had the kids. Before everything else." She traced the rim of her cup with one finger. "I wanted to keep bees. Had this notion I'd sell honey in jars with calico lids. That was before I understood how much land costs. You still could. Not with 2 children and no spare money." He nodded once. "What if there was land? Not much, just enough for a few hives." She studied him. "You thinking to give me land now?" "No, I'm thinking of building something with you, not for you." Her face didn't change much, but her voice softened. "You always say things plain. I don't know how else to mean them." She stood then, walked to the shelf, and took down a small cloth bundle. Inside were 3 beeswax candles, short and slightly misshapen. "I made these a while back," she said. "Couldn't keep wax from cracking, but they hold flame." He took one from her hand. "You kept them." "I don't throw away things with use left." Dawson turned the candle in his palm. "Neither do I." The next morning, Odessa found a stretch of ground near the back fence already cleared. The soil had been worked, the rocks hauled aside. Dawson was nearby, hammering slats for a shallow box. She crossed her arms. You're getting ahead of yourself." He glanced up. "You said bees, didn't you?" I said I used to want them. "Well, maybe it's time to want something again." She didn't answer him, but she brought him water at midday, and she didn't hide the smile when she did. Later that week, Dawson rode into town for supplies. Odessa stayed behind, tending the garden rows and keeping the children close under the rising heat. When he returned, he brought flour, salt, and 3 lengths of screen mesh. He didn't say what it was for, but she knew. That night, as they sat on the step outside with the air thick and heavy with early summer, Odessa rested her head lightly against his shoulder. He didn't speak. He just reached over and took her hand. "You remember what you told me?" she asked. "Which part?" "That you don't want someone to carry, just someone to walk beside," he nodded. "I've been walking alone for so long I forgot what it felt like not to. You're not alone anymore." She turned her face toward him, eyes steady. "I want to marry you, Dawson." He didn't move right away. Then he said, "You sure?" "I'm sure." He looked out toward the pasture where the dusk lay thick over the grass. "Then we'll do it proper. I'll ride to the preacher by week's end." She took his hand tighter. "Don't wait." He turned toward her. "You want to stand by the river tomorrow, just us and the children? I can say vows without a collar. That's all I need." He brushed her cheek with the back of his hand, gentle, reverent. "You aren't pretty, Odessa, but you are the truest thing I've ever known." She smiled, quiet and full. "That's all I ever wanted to be." And when the sun rose the next morning over the basin, it rose on a woman who no longer walked alone. The morning they married, the river ran high from spring melt, flecked with silt and the cold breath of the mountains. Odessa wore a clean calico dress she had let down at the hem, and Becca had tucked a sprig of yarrow into her hair. Billy stood beside Dawson, chin lifted, his fingers curled tight around a strip of rawhide he'd braided himself. They said the words soft and plain, their voices barely louder than the current. Dawson spoke first, his hand steady in hers. "I'll stand beside you. I'll carry what I can. I'll make a place you can rest, and I'll never ask you to be anything but who you already are." Odessa didn't look away when she answered, her voice low and sure. "I'll walk with you. I'll raise what we grow and tend what we build. I won't run when things get hard, and I won't forget what we found here." Billy handed them 2 river stones he'd picked earlier, smooth and damp. They set them side by side on a flat stump near the water, a mark of it being done. Then Dawson reached down and lifted Becca into his arms, and she clung to his neck like she'd always belonged there. They walked back to the cabin together, no fanfare, just the sound of the wind in the grass and the crackle of the fence gate as Dawson swung it open. That evening, Odessa mixed dough with her sleeves rolled high and her hair damp from washing. Dawson cleaned his tools by lamplight. Billy read aloud from the primer, stumbling only once. Becca pressed her fingers into the soft clay Dawson had brought from the creek and shaped a crooked heart. After the children were asleep, they sat close on the edge of the bed Dawson had widened with spare timbers. Odessa looked down at her hands, the skin rough from work, and then over at him. "I didn't expect to feel settled so soon." He leaned back against the wall. "You think it's too soon?" "No," she said. "I think I didn't know what settled felt like until now." He reached over and touched the inside of her wrist, light as breath. "You still want bees?" "Yes." "Then come with me day after tomorrow. There's a man near Fort Benton with a start of hives. I've got enough saved." She looked at him carefully. "You don't need to do that." "I know," he said, "but I want to." They didn't say anything more after that. They lay down with the window open to the warm night, the sound of crickets and slow wind filling the space between them. Odessa rested her head against his chest, and for the first time in more years than she could count, she didn't keep one ear tilted toward the dark. By summer's end, the hives stood in a neat row behind the garden, and the first golden combs waited in muslin-wrapped jars on the shelf. Becca had taken to humming near the bees, and Billy had learned to work the smoker without flinching. The garden held fat squash and runner beans, and Dawson added a second shelf to the root cellar. The fence was mended all the way to the southern line, and Dawson had built a bench beneath the cottonwood where Odessa liked to sit late in the day, her sewing in her lap and her eyes watching the pasture. Sometimes he joined her there, his palm warm against her knee, no words needed. One afternoon in late September, they rode together to a neighbor's harvest gathering, Billy holding Becca in front of him on the saddle. Odessa wore a shawl Dawson had traded for from a traveling peddler, thick wool the color of wet stone. She didn't ask why he gave it to her. She just wore it and held his hand when the music started. They danced once, slow and unhurried, his hand at her back, hers at his shoulder. He didn't lead too strong, and she didn't follow too soft. They moved together like they'd always been meant to. That night back at the cabin, she stood barefoot at the doorway watching the stars. Dawson came up behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist and rested his chin on her shoulder. "You tired?" he asked. "No, just full." He pressed a kiss to her neck, slow and reverent. "I love you, Odessa." She turned her head just enough to meet his eyes. "I know, and I love you too." The wind picked up across the field, rustling the dry stalks, but inside the house everything was still. Years passed. The children grew strong and tall. Becca took to drawing flowers in the dirt with a stick, and Billy rode the gelding alone to the edge of the timberline. Odessa added 2 more hives. Dawson built a second cabin for guests, though it rarely held anyone but distant kin passing through. They grew older without rushing. Life was not easy, but it was fair. They worked side by side, shoulder to shoulder, and every night they came back to the same fire, the same porch, the same steady hands reaching for each other. Nothing broke them. Nothing bent them. They had known too much of the world to expect ease. But they had built something better. Something made of quiet mornings, mended fences, and the kind of love that didn't need proving. And in the end, that was all either of them had ever wanted.